Hello everyone, so today we're here with Dr. Gary James, who is a football historian writer. So you've written many books, particularly about the history of Man City. I was wondering if you could just tell us first a bit about where your interest for football came from.
Yeah, I mean, I was taken to watch men's football from an early age. And my parents used to take me to Main Road, Manchester City's old ground, when I was a baby, actually. So I had no choice. But my family is typical of a lot of Manchester families in that it's half blue and half red. So I've always had an interest in both clubs, although I am a City fan, but I've always had an interest in both clubs. So I've always when I started researching, I was always keen to research about both Manchester clubs and to really understand about them. And so that was it really. When I was a teenager, that's when I really sort of travelled home and away watching football.
Brilliant. And you wrote your first book in 1989, From Main Men to Banana Citizens.
Yeah, it's a bit of a silly title, but yeah, I was 21 at the time. Yeah.
Just if you could tell us really about where your passion for writing came from.
Yeah, I mean, it was a funny one that I started to buy and sort of collect football books. I wanted to read about the game. I was going to matches. I was a season ticket holder, but I wanted to understand about the history of the game. And in 1987, it would have been when I was about 19. I used to go into bookshops like W.H. Smith's or wherever, and I'd see books on Liverpool, United, Leeds United as well then, and Everton, but rarely see any books on Manchester City. And this book came out on a team called Bradford Park Avenue, which Bradford Park Avenue had been in the Football League up until the sort of 60s, and then it's really sort of ceased to exist. Now they were reformed and they had a life outside of a Football League, but when this book came out, for me it was, I felt as if you can write a book about a team that no longer exists, if you like, then surely you can do a book about Manchester City. And I sent a cheeky letter, letter back in those days. I sent a cheeky letter to the publisher of that book. And it's the freakiest thing, really, because this is just not the way it would normally happen. But I was really fortunate. I actually got a phone call, and I was told that publisher was actually considering doing a book on Manchester City, but what they needed was somebody who had a bit of expertise about the club. And so at that point, I think deep down I'd always wanted to do something like write a book, but I hadn't really thought I could. And anyway, I met them, I talked to them, and initially the first book was basically a photographic book with a few the odd page of writing, a few captions, a few stories, if you like, but it was more of a pictorial history. It wasn't a detailed book, but from that point on, I really wanted to write more and more and more. And in that very first book, actually, I did include a small bit on Manchester City's original women's team, Manchester City Ladies. My wife, she was my girlfriend then, but my wife now, but my girlfriend then, was a footballer in the Manchester area. She'd played for a team called FC Red Star in Manchester. And then when Manchester City Ladies was being established in 1988, she joined that club, and she scored in the very first game. And I used to go and watch when she played for Red Star and when she played for City Ladies. I used to go and watch her every Sunday morning. And so when I produced that first book, I thought I felt then that this City Ladies team, as it was important to some extent. I mean, on the face of it, it was just normal Sunday morning women's football team, but I just felt it deserved to go in the book. So it was only a page, but it went in the book.
Nice. So leading on from that, obviously today we're going to be talking about your book, Manchester City Women and Oral History. So you've written a number of books over the years, but what was the one thing that inspired you to start writing a whole book based on the Manchester City women's team?
When the football club was relaunched, so when Manchester City Ladies was relaunched as Manchester City Women, there was an awful lot of coverage, obviously, because they got the place in the WSL, which whether it's right or it's wrong, and the politics that involved with it, it was quite controversial at the time. And I understand the controversy, and I sort of shared it to some extent. But one thing that was abundantly clear was that the women who had played for Manchester City from 1988 all the way through up until 2012, 2013, or whatever, felt as if they'd been excluded from history. And it happens so many times. The people who write the history books focus on what they want to write about quite often. And obviously I'm a white male Manchester City fan, so my first book was a white male Manchester City book. That's wrong saying it like that, but you know what I mean. And so a lot of the talk was that Manchester City Women was a completely new club, as if it's a airbrushed history. Now, it wasn't. A few of the women who had been in touch with Manchester City to say, look, we existed, right? And City knew that, but they didn't quite understand the full history, perhaps. They didn't know of how close the relationship had been, or that the club had been created as part of Manchester City back in 1988. So I had a few conversations with the club, and I said I was going to do a project. I wanted to interview as many of the women involved in the club throughout its history, all the way through to, well, at the time, Steph Orton and Karen Bardsley and Jill Scott and so on. I want to interview some of these women and basically put that story into the book. And for me, as a historian, as a writer, I wanted to make sure the book was one that would be equal to what I would have wanted to do on a men's team. I did not want this to be a lightweight, flimsy, whatever. I wanted this to be a 100,000 word book. I also wanted it to be attractive in look. So, it's a colourful book. It's got lots of photographs in, because quite often a photograph will help to explain a moment better than, if I say the type of kit that the women wore originally was hand-me-down kit, great to show a photograph of them wearing a hand-me-down kit. So I wanted to make sure that this book was equal to, in every way possible, a book about Premier League men's club. And okay, I have written bigger men's Premier League books, but there's 100,000 words in there. There's a statistical record of every season, which is pretty rare for a women's team that's 30 years old. And obviously I've struggled to get some of that information. But more importantly, above everything else, it's the voices of the women who played, because I was conscious all the way through that I don't want to interpret what somebody says. I want what they say to be the story. So Jill Scott, for example, talks about how when she was playing as a girl, she was actually playing against boys, obviously, at that time, in a mixed team. And some of the parents of the boys were shouting for the boys to go and kick that girl because she's a girl, basically. And so that, for me, for Jill Scott saying that, if I put that in the book, which I have done, I don't want me to interpret it. I want Jill Scott to say it. And I've got women talking about how, in the 1970s, because some of the women obviously played before they joined Manchester City. Been playing. One had been playing from the 60s, and one from the early 70s, and another one from about 1972. And that one of them talks about how she was so embarrassed that she didn't know how to tell her parents that she was playing football, and she needed to buy a pair of football boots. She didn't own her own pair of football boots, so she actually spoke to her brother, and eventually, through her brother, she talked to her mum, and she told her mum, I'm going to play football. And then everyone was supportive, but it was just the sort of journey that she had to go through. And there's lots more like that, yeah.
That's great. I mean, that actually leads me on to the next question I wanted to ask you, really, was did you find any conflicting accounts when you were getting your information together?
Yes.
And how did you get to what hopefully was the truth for the book?
Well, the key thing was that all along I knew I would get conflicting accounts, but I suppose probably the best example is that in the general story of the club, and something I wrote an article about it about 8 years ago as well, but in the general story of the club, there was a belief that the team had played an FA Cup match against Crewe, and that long story about this game, and but basically they lost this game, but it was a key moment, and people, when I interviewed them, people talked about this FA Cup game, talking about this being the first FA Cup game, and then actually I managed to find newspaper reports. Quite a lot of the women who played had obviously made their scrapbooks or saved their programs and so on, and then there's some other stuff in libraries, and I've searched and searched, and eventually with the match reports and so on, I managed to piece together that this was an important game. But it was a Northwest Women's League Cup competition, so it was like the equivalent of the FA Cup, or the equivalent of the League Cup, I suppose, for that league, for the Northwest region. It was actually another game later that season that was the first FA Cup tie, which was against Wigan, and was a big defeat actually. But it just shows you. So simple things like, over time our memories fade, and so on. And to be frank, I've had this with footballers. I did a biography of a guy called Joe Mercer, who'd been an England manager and a manager of Manchester City, and played for Arsenal. And his career ended when he played for Arsenal at the age of 39. He broke his leg. And he wrote, in the 1960s, he wrote a biography in which he himself got his leg wrong. He said, I think he said he broke his right leg when it was his left leg, or something like that. And just before my biography of Joe was to be published, his son said to me, "Just one thought, you do know which leg he broke, don't you?" And frantically I'm checking, and yes, I got it right. But people, because if you think about it, if you when you play football or you carry out an activity, you're living that moment. And 10, 20, 30 years later, myths develop. You start to fool yourself into thinking certain things. People tell you something, and gradually those stories can get distorted. But whenever there was a conflict, sometimes I actually put the disagreement, if you like. One person believes this and one person believes that. But most of the time, I've tried to find the most likely version based on whatever evidence I can find.
Yeah, that's great. And I was going to say as well, when you were doing research in the book, did you encounter any barriers trying to get people to speak to get the accounts and the sort of the information?
Yeah. I mean, I knew well, some of the women I already knew because of my, I was on the sidelines for the first 4 years of the club, so I knew some of the women anyway, so that wasn't too difficult. But obviously most of the women I didn't know. Most of the women had come along after I'd left, or I'd left in terms of as a supporter or whatever. So it was, I put out appeals to try and track people down, and then every so often somebody would say, "You really need to interview such and such," and I'd get in touch with that person, and sometimes they'd say, "I don't want to talk to Manchester City because," and quite often it'd be about something that had happened, in 1992 or whatever, when somebody fell out with the club and things didn't go the way they wanted to. Well, most of the personnel, all the personnel have changed over the years, so that shouldn't really be a concern anymore. But obviously, I understand that. Some people felt that some people felt they just didn't want to be interviewed because they were nervous. And in some cases, people allowed me to borrow their scrapbooks and their collection, but they just didn't do an interview. But overall, I think more or less everybody ended up being interviewed who I wanted to interview or who came forward. There were some people I would have liked to interview who just didn't for whatever reason. But yeah, and even now, if there are people connected with the club who feel their stories still need to be recorded in some way, then Manchester City's archivist actually is prepared to do an interview and record that and build that. So, they see this as being a living archive, really, and the book is just one part of that.
Yeah. Nice. So back to it being an oral history, obviously the idea of the book was to give voices to these women who are pioneers of the women's game, really. What was that like for you, being able to give these women a voice who felt like they had been forgotten?
I think I was just I just had the means to make it happen, if you like. I mean, every one of the women who played, well, some of the women have been extremely vocal over the years, but for whatever reason, their stories weren't being remembered. So what I wanted to do was, for me, it was produce the book, because that's then a permanent record which should be there forever now. You know, it should be there forever. It's not, I wanted those stories to be told, and I wanted those stories to get out there, and I wanted people to realise that this wasn't a club that had just been established, and I also wanted it to realise that had it not been for the women at every point of that club's history, there would never been a club, if you like. You know, I'm sure they could have created one just like that now, like some other clubs have done, but for me, it's the fact it's got this 30-year history that makes it something different. And those stories, I mean, there's some women who were involved in the club from around about 1989 through to 2005, 2006. It's a long, long time to be involved with any club. And for their history to have just not been considered, you know, it's just not on. I'm the lucky person who told the story. Ideally, the world would be such that all of those stories are automatically out there and recorded. Sadly, you know, it's not that way. But I think, yeah, I enjoyed every minute of it, actually.
Oh, that was something I was going to ask you, really. When you were researching the book, what was the most interesting? Have you got a favourite or interesting story that went into the book?
Oh, there's quite a few. I mean, there's one story which I didn't know. I mean, people tend to think that when the football club was first established, it was a group of Manchester City fans who created a team. That's not true at all. It was a team that was created by Manchester City, and the people who played for that team went through a series of trials and so on. And of course, a lot of them were City fans, but a lot of them also were fans of Manchester United, for example, or Liverpool. And one of the fans of Manchester United, she actually lived near Old Trafford, the Manchester United's men's ground. And it was her turn to take the kit home to wash. And she didn't really think anything of it. She went home, she put it in the washing machine, hung it out to dry, went out. And Mum was at home that afternoon. And Mum, when the player came back, and Mum went mad at her. She said, "What are you doing putting 11 Manchester City shirts on our washing line? There's a match at Old Trafford today, and all the United fans have been walking past giving abuse." So, yeah, so there's stories like that. I mean, there were some interesting stories just about the state of play back in the early 90s, really. For example, there was a game on Merseyside where they arrived at the ground and the goalposts were in a pub backyard, because if the goalposts had been left out on the pitch, they'd have been taken. So before the game, the women are carrying these goalposts across the road and fitting them up, and so I mean, obviously they normally got used to putting the nets up and so on, but this is carrying the actual posts as well.
So obviously you mentioned earlier your wife actually played for the Manchester City ladies team, and you attended their first game against Oldham Athletic ladies, where I believe they won 4-1 in 1988.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering how, I mean, obviously now, did that come about because of your wife, or did you go to support her?
Yes, to be frank, yes. I mean, I did. I did, because obviously at that point I was already writing my first book. It took a long time to get that first book. Well, it took 2 years to get that going, actually. But I was already writing that. I used to go and watch her play for FC Red Star. And so for me, this was, you know, I was going to watch her play football. And it was at Boundary Park, which I think is really significant, that the first ever Manchester City women's game was at a proper, it wasn't Premier League then, but a proper major ground, if you like. You know, Boundary Park was a really significant venue, if you like, to play that game at. And I know that the game, there's a video film of the game that my father-in-law actually filmed. We've not been able to find that, unfortunately, which is a real shame. But that game got a little bit of coverage in a couple of newspapers, not much, a little bit of coverage in local newspapers. But it was a great game. And the first ever goal scorer was a player called Donna Haynes. And Donna, who actually is a Manchester United fan, but Donna was a great player. And Manchester City have recently produced a pack of cards which are legends of the club, basically the men's club, if you like. However, four of the cards, the queens in that pack of cards, four of the cards are actually female players. And Donna Haynes, the very first goal scorer in 1988, is actually one of those queens, which I think is great, because it sort of, in some ways, it sort of proves the research and the project we did and everything else was of value, really, because I'm not certain that prior to 2010, anybody would really have quite remembered Donna's name in relation to Manchester City's women's team, apart from those who were involved at the time. So I'm quite pleased about that. My wife also, Donna scored 2 goals in that first game, and my wife also scored 2 goals in that first game. So obviously that's a great thing as well. But yeah, I've got to be honest, I initially went because she was my girlfriend, and I was interested in that. And I remember the first time I ever went to watch a women's game, which was FC Red Star, the first team I was aware of that she played for anyway. And it was just, I was really impressed. I used to go home and away watching Manchester City men's team, and here I was on a Sunday morning, really enjoying, seeing Red Star it was, and then City ladies after that. And I used to try and encourage people to go and watch. And when City ladies became established, they eventually played Manchester United ladies, the original ladies team from United, in 1989. I'd have to check that in the book, actually. It might be 1990, but anyway, it's around that time. They played them in the Northwest Women's Regional League First Division, and there's a crowd of about 150 people there on a Sunday morning at just a normal park pitch. And I was quite pleased with that, because there were people there who probably come because it was City v United, but and it may well have been their first experience of women's football, but that day, that was as full-blooded a Manchester derby match as any game over the years. And that sort of, I suppose for me, really, that sort of set the tone of what the women's team was about. It was a team that could achieve success, and it did achieve success. It achieved a promotion in its first couple of seasons and so on. The sad thing was, I suppose, in 1988, 1990, nationally, women's football wasn't at a level where it could have a national league in the way that it has today.
Yeah, and how would you compare the experience of going to a game then versus going to a Manchester City women's game now, obviously when we could pre-COVID?
Well, it's obviously a different world, because obviously it's in a stadium. There could be 4,000 people there. You're seeing international footballers who have got the best facilities you can possibly get at a football club. I mean, I do often wonder, what if you took the women who played in the late 80s and gave them the same coaching, the same fitness techniques, the same facilities, all of that, the same equipment, how it would compare. Because I think there were some fantastic players back then, but they just didn't have those opportunities. Just didn't get the outlets, really, and it's a shame. But it's, I mean, the atmosphere at a City women game is superb. They've got a really passionate supporters club who are banging drums and doing, not making all sorts of noise throughout the game, and it's a good atmosphere. It's a better atmosphere in terms of friendliness and positivity, if you like, than it quite often is. Well, than it is at men's football. Men's football, it's tribal in both areas. Obviously, men's football and women's football can be tribal, but it's a different sort of tribal. You sort of recognise good play in a different way. If the opposition do something fantastic, it's recognised. That's not always the case with men's football. It does happen, but not always.
Yeah. Just going back to the book, on completion of the book, obviously it was quite a detailed book that you did. Is there anything that you feel, any stones left unturned, or something that you wish you'd put into the book that you haven't?
Well, and this always tends to happen when I do a book. Within days of it being published, something comes to light. And a team photograph has been rediscovered from that very first game at Boundary Park at Oldham Athletic. If only I'd have had that to put in the book. So, you know, I've got a match report, but I haven't got a photograph from that very first game, but it's come to light since. There are a lot of games where we know what day the game took place. We know that the game took place, but in some cases we still don't have the scores. You know, the scores have gone missing over time. In other cases, we have the scores, we have the date, we have the team, we don't know who scored the goals. You know, so there's lots of gaps like that which I'd like to fill in. I mean, the book could easily have been 200,000 words. There's so many memories, so many stories, and I think, yeah, I would have liked to have interviewed twice as many people and done a book twice the size, but obviously it probably wouldn't have been published. One thing I will say about it being published, in the end, it was difficult getting a publisher, and the only way I could get this book published was to do it to do a Kickstarter sort of crowdfunding idea. So basically people ordered the book before it was published, or pledged money to have the book published, and once we reached a certain level it could be published. And that's something that I hope changes in the future. You know, I wanted this book to be a model book for other women's clubs. I'm not saying, you know, there have been some great books on women's football. I'm not saying there hasn't been, but it's difficult to get books on a particular women's team published. Publishers just don't seem to want to do it. And I would like to see lots more people write books on women's football clubs, get them published, and for them to be as well received as this one has, because I think there's a definite market there, definite interest there. Sadly, people tend to focus on the big six men's team or whatever it may be, and that's not the way football should be.
Yeah, that actually leads me on to another question I've got for you. If you had to write another book on a women's team, which team would you choose?
Well, it's interesting actually, because alongside this, I was doing quite a bit of research on Manchester in general, because typically you'd play for one club and you'd move to another club, and that's the way it would work. You know, quite often 6 people would leave one club, create another club, and then, you know, and that would go on and have a life of its own. And so I over the years I've done quite a bit of research on some of the other teams in the Manchester area going right back. There's 2 pioneering teams that started in the 1940s in Manchester, one called Manchester Ladies and one called Manchester Corinthians. And I've interviewed some of the players connected with Corinthians, and they're fantastic. They've got some great stories, stories about when they were trying to buy football boots, actually pretending they were buying them to play hockey, because the sports shop wouldn't sell them boots if they thought they were playing football. So it's that sort of thing. There's also teams like Manchester United Ladies. The history of Manchester United Ladies, you know, it starts in the 70s. Yes, the club closed it down, and then it didn't come back again until only a couple of years ago now. But their history needs to be out there. It's been delayed, and it could be another couple of years before I actually manage to finish this, but I am trying to do a book on the history of female participation and involvement in football in Manchester, and what that will be, not just about playing football and the teams in Manchester, but also about women at football matches, men's football matches, women as players, their stories, women as players' wives, women as, obviously, as fans, women in working in the media, and so on. And I've done quite a lot of interviews for that, but various things have got in the way. But about 12 years ago, I did a book called Manchester Football History, which was the history of the men's game in Manchester. So I'd like to do the same for women, and that does cover media support as well as the actual teams. So yeah, that's the next big project, I guess.
Yeah, so another thing I actually wanted to ask you about, obviously the great thing we've agreed about women's football is that it's built on a sense of community and solidarity. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were on the new Europa Super League and how this could potentially damage the women's game.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? We don't yet know enough. I mean, I think there needs to be. I mean, we have a European Cup in the women's game, so there's already a competition there. And what I would find really hard to take is if a women's tournament was organised, whatever that tournament is, but a women's tournament is organised that simply is an add-on to a men's tournament. So if there are 20 men's teams, you know, in a super league of whatever shape or form that is, not all of those 20 men's teams will necessarily be a great women's team, because women's teams and men's teams can go down completely different pathways. You know, if you look in the past, Doncaster Bells were hugely successful. Doncaster Rovers wasn't, right? And they had an association for a period of time and so on. Manchester City's women's team could win every trophy. Manchester City men's team may not. Teams like Lyon, the men's team might never ever get into any form of Champions League, but the women's team obviously would do. So I think it's too early to say, but I think you cannot do something, you cannot use the name of a men's team or women's team and automatically assume it should have both at playing at the highest level. It has to be, football has to be about promotion and relegation and so on. And I know we can talk about the birth of the Women's Super League. That wasn't quite that. We can talk about the birth of the second tier of the Women's Super League, and that wasn't that either. But it's something that we can't just create a league for female clubs that are an add-on to a men's team, and that's what it feels like. I might be totally wrong, but that's what it feels like.
Yeah, definitely.
Just for people who would like to get your book, obviously I know you can, Manchester Women, the oral history is on Amazon. Are there any other sort of places where they can buy the book?
Yeah, I've got a website, and you can order it direct from me if you like, and every copy will be signed that's ordered direct from me. But the website's called gjfootballarchive.com. GJ my initials and then footballarchive.com. So yeah, there's a shop on there, and basically you can go on that and do it. Also, the Manchester City Women's Supporters Club are selling copies as well, and if you buy from them, obviously they're raising funds for their work, and they do an awful lot of good work around the women's game. So if you don't buy it from me, buy it from them if you like.
Great. Thank you.
And any final piece of advice you would give to anyone who wishes to get into football writing?
Do it. Start. The first thing I would say is, people often say, how do I start? What do I do? Get your ideas down on paper. I often find that when I'm sort of thinking about something, I can think about it and think about it and think about it, and I don't do it. So much better get it down, not on paper, on the computer, but start getting it down, or jotting ideas down maybe, but get something down. You can always come back and revise it. And I'd also say, try and if it's the first time you've written something, try and write about something that matters to you, something that you're passionate about, because yes, you can get carried away and you can sort of be blinded by your own sort of thoughts, if you like, but it's better to have the passion and to write about something you love and you enjoy, or you feel strongly about, where even if that's negatively, it's better to do that and get it down. getting a book. If you're trying to approach publishers, you need to put together a treatment, which is basically a plan of a book and sample chapters. That can be frustrating at times, but what I would say is just try and get something down, try and do it, and hopefully it'll all work out.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure, and it's been really interesting to hear more. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.